This week in wrestling history, we go all the way back, half a century, in fact, 50 years ago this week on February 8th, 1971, WWE Hall of Famer Pedro Morales, maybe the biggest Hispanic star that WWE ever had, having sold out Madison Square Garden in title matches 21 times in his career, beat Ivan Koloff to become WWF champion, kicking off a nearly 3-year run as the champion, lasting 1,027 days. He's also WWE's first Triple Crown winner, holding the WWE title, the Intercontinental title, on 2 occasions. That came years later. And the WWE Tag Team titles, once with Bob Backlund before they were forced to forfeit them the following day because of a rule that stated that the world champion, who was Backlund at that time, could not hold more than one title at one time. Speaking of titles, 46 years ago this week, on that same date in 1975, Ric Flair won his very first singles pro wrestling championship, defeating Paul Jones for the NWA Mid-Atlantic Television title. 37 years ago this week, on February 10th, 1984, the second in a long line of Von Erich family tragedies, David Von Erich died at the age of 25 in his hotel room while on an overseas tour of Japan from what was said to be, and what his brother Kevin insists, was a heart attack that was caused by ruptured intestines resulting from acute enteritis. The story over the years has changed a little bit, I think, even with the family, in terms of exactly what went down and when. They've claimed that it was a kick during a match in Japan that ruptured his intestine, which is not true because he died before he even wrestled his first match on that tour. On the Dark Side of the Ring episode devoted to the Von Erich family, which I did a whole review on at that time, Kevin says that David was throwing up before he left for Japan. But his father insisted that he make the trip, and so he flew over there. Ric Flair and a lot of other wrestlers from that period are convinced that it was a drug overdose that killed him. Dave Meltzer, years ago, after Kerry died, noted that David was out at Ribera Steakhouse the night before and was doing a lot of drinking. And the next day, when he didn't come down to the lobby of the lobby of the hotel, one of the Japanese referees went to the hotel room with Bruiser Brody and found him dead. And that it was, the claim is that it was Brody who flushed the drugs that they found down the toilet, and that it was alleged to be the same drug his brother Michael later overdosed on, which was a drug called Placidil, which is a medication that was commonly prescribed at one time to treat insomnia. I don't even think they manufacture it anymore, in part because so many people were abusing them. We even had a Supreme Court justice in this country who was addicted to them. Kevin says otherwise, and the autopsy backs up his claim, so we'll just have to leave it at that. David was the one that they thought would be the first to win the NWA World title. He never had that chance. Instead, at a tribute show for David a few months later at Texas Stadium, 45,000 people in the stands, it was his brother Kerry, the future Texas Tornado, who would beat Ric Flair to become NWA World Champion. Kerry only held the title for 18 days before dropping it to Flair in Japan because Kerry had substance abuse problems of his own and just was not reliable enough to trust in that spot, at least not trust longer than 18 days. And so it was less than 3 weeks later and his run was over. 29 years ago this week, on February 8th, 1992, the first edition of Saturday Night's Main Event to air on Fox. After years of airing on NBC, this show is an hour instead of the usual 90 minutes. Taped on January 27th in Lubbock, Texas, with Hulk Hogan and Sid Justice putting aside their differences from the Royal Rumble to take on Ric Flair and The Undertaker. Sid bailed on Hogan mid-match. When Hogan reached for the tag, Sid jumped down from the apron. This set up their WrestleMania 8 match. Hogan versus Flair had already been announced on television for the title, but it was never actually planned to be the main event. It was all part of the storyline. We'll announce Hogan versus Flair. Hogan then has this falling out and this issue with Sid, and the match gets changed, and then they can promote a big double main event with Hogan in possibly his final match because he was going away for a while. Which, honestly, I think as much as anything, that probably has to do with why the Flair match didn't happen. You know, all that stuff about how their house show matches were underperforming and didn't do great business. They ran that match a whole bunch of times. And so it's sort of, you know, granted back then, if it was a live event, people in other markets wouldn't know or they wouldn't see it. It's not like, you know, the internet today. But they did run the match a whole bunch of times. I don't know that they necessarily should have been doing that. But I still think a main event at WrestleMania for the title between Hogan and Flair would have done well. Maybe not as well as it would have done in 1986. But I think as much as anything, Hogan, they knew he was leaving. I don't know when they knew he was leaving, but they knew he was going away for a while with all the scandals that were going on at that time. Hogan, he was going to step away for a while, possibly for a year, which is really what happened. And if that were the case, you would have to have either a disqualification finish so that you don't put the title on Hogan, or Flair would have to beat him. And well, we all know that was never going to happen, let alone in the main event of WrestleMania. So that's as much as anything, I think that's why we didn't get the match. Hogan was going away. Otherwise, it would have been an easy Hogan title win, right? It would have been Hulk Hogan winning the championship and posing and celebrating at the end of WrestleMania, which I guess he did anyway. But it was a lot easier for him to get a DQ win over Sid than it would have been in a championship match. And so they got to promote a title match out of it between Savage and Flair. They did the whole big double main event promotion for the show. But this episode also featured the blow-off match to one of my all-time favorite feuds between Macho Man Randy Savage and Jake the Snake Roberts, which should have happened. Talk about matches that should have happened at WrestleMania. This blow-off for this feud deserved a bigger stage. And it deserved to happen at WrestleMania. Savage pinned him clean with the elbow drop. Afterwards, Jake was waiting backstage for Savage and Liz to come back through the curtain. He had a steel chair in his hand. He was gonna do some damage. He had some evil intentions with that chair. And as they came through the curtain, he reared back with the chair, but before he can fire away, the Undertaker, who he had been allied with up to that point for several months, the Undertaker grabbed the chair out of his hand and prevented him from using it and turned himself babyface in the process. Now, I think they turned him because a lot of fans were already cheering the Undertaker because they thought he was fucking cool. They loved the gimmick. But this was his official babyface turn. I don't think they actually showed that footage. In fact, I know they didn't. They didn't show that footage until the syndicated shows over the weekend or the following weekend. They even had Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan who were doing commentary for the show. They really acted as if when they showed this, never before seen footage the following weekend, they were airing this as if, well, okay, we're off the air. Show's over, right? We're off the air. Vince is telling Bobby, he goes, boy, I thought that was your worst performance yet. So they were really milking it, trying to make it as if, okay, this is unplanned now. The show's over. This is not part of the show, folks. And that marked the babyface turn of The Undertaker, who I believe was a babyface all the way up until 1998. 25 years ago this week, on February 11th, 1996, at the WCW Super Brawl pay-per-view, Kevin Sullivan and Brian Pillman were all set to have a strap match where the winner would be determined only when their opponent said the words, "I respect you." Not even a full 60 seconds into the match, Pillman grabbed the mic out of the referee's hand and told Sullivan, "I respect you, BOOKERMAN," before walking out, making reference to Sullivan being the booker at that time for WCW. In late 95, early 96, Pillman was just trying to find a way to stay relevant. WCW had Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage and Ric Flair, all those big names. The Giant, who was new, but he was still bigger in the pecking order than Pillman was. And he was just looking for a way to break through, and he was very concerned about his future in the company. So he worked with Eric Bischoff to get this new loose cannon gimmick over. And Bischoff claims that he encouraged Pillman to leave WCW and go work elsewhere, and then come back to help make himself an even bigger name and really get the gimmick over. I think a lot of that, and that was true of ECW, but I don't buy for a second that Bischoff encouraged him to go get a deal with Vince McMahon. I don't buy that for a second. I think that's more of Bischoff having egg on his face because he got duped. He got swerved. And he was trying to just save face because, again, Pillman had convinced him to have Turner fax him real release papers to make it look real. Don't just send papers over, send real release papers, letting me out of my contract. Which he then used to sign a very real contract with the WWF. But on this night, after Pillman pulled the Bookerman line and left, a minute into what was supposed to be a 12-minute match, there was genuine panic backstage, per the Observer. They sent Arn Anderson out to the ring to wrestle Sullivan in an impromptu match. You got to go back and watch this. Arn walks out because Jimmy Hart goes to get him, and here comes Arn Anderson. And Arn Anderson looks like he was dressed for Oktoberfest. In his dress shirt, he's got red shorts on. They went to a no contest when Ric Flair came out and told him to stop fighting because the Dungeon of Doom, which is what Kevin Sullivan was part of, and the Horsemen, which is obviously what Arn was part of, they shared a common enemy, that being Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania. We shouldn't be fighting. We should be uniting. But after this, Pillman was fired, quote-unquote fired, and the idea was that he would get the loose cannon deal over at ECW, because, I'm sure to Bischoff it was no big deal if he went to ECW. ECW was still in his mind, it was probably still just a little dumpy promotion. Yeah, they do a lot of risque stuff. Pillman could go there and be very controversial and get himself more over with that audience and fine-tune the character and then eventually come back to Uncle Eric and WCW. Didn't quite work out that way. He had the horrible Humvee wreck. I mean, you talk about just the worst possible thing that could happen at the worst possible time. He had the Humvee wreck. He fell asleep at the wheel. He was in a coma for a week. Didn't know if he would make it. Completely shattered his ankle. Had to have the ankle fused into one position, which really... it really, for all intents and purposes, it ended his in-ring career. He was never the same after that. He was in constant pain. How do you wrestle on that? How do you wrestle on an ankle that's fused into one position? And this is a guy, and this is really part of the tragedy of it, is that he was a high-flying performer. They called him Flying Brian for many years for a reason. So he relied on doing stuff where he would go to the top rope and do a big splash or some of these big flashy moves, and that was it. That was done. He was never going to be able to do that ever again. So it didn't just make it harder for him to wrestle. It didn't make it impossible for him to wrestle pain-free, but he couldn't do all of the things that helped get him over in the first place as Flying Brian. But he was able to negotiate a deal to go to the WWF during this period afterwards when he came out of the coma and he started to recover. And I think he also hid the severity of his injury from WWE. I think if WWE knew how badly he really was hurt, plus the addiction issues that he had, I don't think there's any way they would have signed him. Or if they did, they would have immediately, just tried to get him the help he needed. So I think he hid the severity of it, got the deal with WWE, and like I said, was never the same after that, unfortunately. Pillman was ahead of his time with the loose cannon stuff that he was doing and the promos he was cutting. He was ahead of his time, I would say, probably by a good year or two. He was ahead of his time. A healthy Brian Pillman doing the loose cannon stuff right at the start of the Attitude Era, especially with Steve Austin, right, his former tag team partner, on top as the champion, would have been insanely good. 24 years ago this week, on February 13th, 1997, a special Thursday night episode of Raw as the Westminster Dog Show aired on Monday night and bumped them to a different slot. And also the night that Shawn Michaels announced to the world that he had lost his smile. He lost his smile. This was supposed to be the rematch from the Royal Rumble, with Michaels defending the WWF title against Psycho Sid in a match that I think Sid may have been scheduled to win. Maybe not originally, but I think as they got closer to the match, because there's so many conflicting stories about what happened and what the plans were and what the plans became, that I think by this point, right before the show, the plan may have been to put the championship on Sid. I know the early plan, and Bret says the same, was that Bret Hart was going to win the Royal Rumble in 1997. And that was the plan. We know that. That was the plan until Vince McMahon changed it to Steve Austin because he felt Vince Russo spoiled the finish. Vince Russo was doing his Vic Venom thing on television at the time. So Russo would make appearances on Livewire. And I'm still waiting on those Livewire episodes, by the way, to drop on the network. I don't have a lot of faith that once they move to Peacock, they're going to be in any kind of rush to get all the old stuff up, but I hope they do at some point, and they don't edit too much out of it, because those shows, to go back and watch them now, the ones you can find on YouTube, you talk about things that were ahead of its time. I mean, they were taking a risk by going live and taking phone calls on TV like that, but they would have Russo in studio for Livewire. He was doing the stuff with the magazine at the time. And I think he was asked on one of the episodes, who do you think is going to win the Royal Rumble? What's your prediction? And he said, well, Bret Hart is going to win the Royal Rumble. Well, Bret Hart was going to win the Royal Rumble, and Vince McMahon was pissed because he thought Russo had basically spoiled the finish. And Russo said, look, he told McMahon, he goes, nobody told me, Bret's going to win. You just asked me for my opinion. That's honestly who I believe was going to win, because he thought it was so predictable. He thought it was so obvious that Bret was going to win the Rumble. So McMahon changed it to swerve everybody. Didn't plan on sending Steve Austin to the WrestleMania main event, as you can tell. But because it was in his mind, you said who the winner is going to be, we have to change it. So we know that. We know that Bret was going to originally win the Rumble that year. He was going to win the Rumble and then get his win back over Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 13. But by this point, the decision may have already been made to go with Undertaker challenging Sid in the WrestleMania main event for the championship, with Bret against Shawn underneath. So it wouldn't be for the title, but we would still get the Bret versus Shawn rematch from WrestleMania 12. Michaels, though, threw a wrench into everything when he announced that he was going to have knee surgery. His knee was so bad that his doctors told him he may never wrestle again. That's how horrible this knee injury was that he had. And he may have had a knee injury. When you fly around the ring the way that Shawn Michaels used to, you're probably going to have knee problems. So I don't doubt that there may have been some kind of a knee injury. Did he exaggerate the seriousness of that knee injury? Do I believe he exaggerated? Absolutely. 100%. But he's out there, talking, and tears in his eyes, and he's talking about this like, oh, my career may be over. And he had to forfeit the championship. So the title was vacated. And there was a legitimate belief that he may never be able to wrestle again. That's why they had him come out and do the speech instead of doing an angle where, Austin or Sid or somebody attacked him because they didn't want to touch him physically. They thought, oh boy, his knee is so bad. We don't want to do anything to make it worse. As it turned out, he was back in the ring less than 3 months later, looking like he never missed a day. In fact, he was back at WrestleMania doing commentary and dancing. He had an entrance. He was dancing in the ring. He didn't look like somebody who had just been told he would need reconstructive surgery that was going to keep him out and possibly end his career. So it was a miraculous recovery for Shawn Michaels. So the Final Four match at the next pay-per-view all of a sudden became a championship match. Now, also on this night, Rocky Maivia won his first title in WWE. He beat Triple H to become Intercontinental Champion, making him the youngest champion, Intercontinental that is, in the history of the company, until Randy Orton came along in 2003 at the age of 23, and he became the youngest Intercontinental Champion of all time 6 years later. But even on this night, with Rock winning the championship and everything, he was already getting a lot of blowback from the crowd. Too much, too soon. There were people in the audience chanting, Rocky sucks. So the backlash had already begun. 23 years ago this week, on February 9th, 1998, the date of the infamous encounter on WCW Monday Nitro between Bill Goldberg and Lord Steven Regal. He had just returned, Regal did, from a suspension after an incident on a flight from Tokyo to Detroit, where he urinated on a flight attendant. I mean, who among us hasn't done that? He was wasted in the restroom, and the door was not completely shut. And when the lady tapped him on the shoulder, and by the way, why is she tapping him on the shoulder if he's in the middle of urinating in the bathroom is what I would like to know. But again, he was wasted, so maybe he was making a scene, or again, if the door was open, she may have just wanted to, maybe she thought he was washing his hands or something. I don't know. But she tapped him on the shoulder, and when she did, he spun around in the middle of peeing, and he peed on her. And the next thing he remembers, he woke up in a jail cell in Alaska in an orange jumpsuit, cuffed to another inmate. This guy that he doesn't know and he's never met before. So he told Steve Austin on his podcast in 2014 that he was on his best behavior here because that incident had just happened. He was just back. And the agent in charge, and he never named who the agent was, but the agent in charge of the match wanted him to go 6 minutes with Goldberg, which is more than twice as long as any of Goldberg's previous matches up to that point in his career, because he only debuted on TV in September. And all of his matches were quick squashes that were over in 2 minutes or less. So him going out there and having a competitive match for 6 minutes was different. It was different for what Goldberg was used to. Go 6 minutes and have a competitive match. That is what Regal says the instructions to him were. And that's what he did. It was the most competitive match of Goldberg's career up to that point. They go out there, and Regal says that Goldberg froze up early in the first couple of minutes of the match. There's a point, if you watch it back, where it looks like Goldberg gets lost or he freezes up. He doesn't know what to do. And he's trying to get him to do stuff, but he's lost, and he's inexperienced. He went from Goldberg to Greenberg. He didn't know what to do. Goldberg has commented on this. He says that Regal took liberties with him and made him look foolish on purpose. I watched the match back again. I'd seen it years ago. I watched the match back again before recording this because I wanted to have it fresh in my mind and see it for myself before I commented on it. And honestly, it's not a bad match. I know people love to say, oh, it was a disaster. I mean, for his career, maybe it was. For Regal's career. The match itself, it's not perfect. It's not pretty. It's not a pretty match. But it's really not a bad match. It's really not. And I don't know if it's just that I've seen some really bad wrestling in the last 10 years or what. You can clearly tell when Goldberg gets lost. But it just comes off like a stiff wrestling match. Goldberg gets some cool-looking takedowns. Regal is, he's the no-nonsense Brit. He's in there working stiff. There's a couple of botch spots that do make you cringe a little bit. But I don't think the match is as bad as people make it out to be. It was kind of nice, actually, to see Goldberg get tested for the first time. He still hit the spear. He still won with the jackhammer. But I don't think anybody watching in the building that night came away thinking, oh, this guy's been exposed. Oh, Goldberg, that's it. The push is over. This guy sucks. So, again, I didn't see any of that. But Regal says he got to the back. Eric Bischoff came up to him, livid, screaming at him. And Regal tells him, look, I can't hit myself. Or meself. I like the way he says it. When he talked to Austin and the way he describes it, I like the way he says it. He says to Eric, I can't hit myself. I can't hit myself. The other person has to be able to work with me. The belief has always been that he was fired immediately after this match. Regal says he was there for 5 more months, in fact. And the reason he was fired was because he was just messed up on drugs. Now, I don't doubt that was either it or that was part of it. He was not there. He was definitely not there 5 more months. His timeline is screwed up when he says that. He was actually fired the very next month. And I'm sure the drugs did have a lot to do with that. But, you got to think that this match here didn't help. The first week of May, he flew out to Connecticut to meet with Vince McMahon for the first time, and Jim Ross and the rest of their team. So this was like a big job interview for him, right? I don't think he had been signed yet. Or maybe he did. Maybe he signed and this was just him going up there for the initial meeting with everybody. I don't know that, but he flies up there. He had gotten his hands before the meeting. He had gotten his hands from someone somewhere on some pills because he had a problem. He needed his pills. And during that meeting, he passed out at Vince McMahon's desk, which is not the best first impression to make, either on your job interview or if you've already been hired, your first day meeting the boss. You don't want to pass out on his desk. It's probably not going to leave a very good first impression. But nobody knew that he had a drug problem yet. They just thought he was sick. Maybe he's under the weather. He's got some kind of virus. In June, he debuted on Raw. I think just as Steven Regal. He was not doing the man's man thing yet. He debuted on Raw. He had one match against Darren Drozdov, and he looked bad enough that we didn't see him for months until he did finally come back later in the fall with the man's man gimmick. In his book, Regal himself says that, when he's talking about his Raw debut, he says, "I looked like a bag of shit." It was not a good time in the life of Steven Regal. 22 years ago, on February 14th, 1999, it was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre with the first ever singles match between Vince McMahon and Stone Cold Steve Austin, not counting that non-match they had on Raw in April of 98. I don't count that as a match. It never happened. It was a no contest. That was Dude Love coming out and ruining it, so I don't count that. This was their first official one-on-one meeting against each other through this whole Austin versus McMahon feud. It was also the final pay-per-view to use the In Your House subtitle. A show that saw Al Snow and Hardcore Holly fight out of the arena and into the mighty Mississippi River. And Austin defeat McMahon when McMahon's master plan backfired. So, some backstory first. Vince McMahon had won the Royal Rumble match, right? To earn a championship shot at WrestleMania. He was going to forego his shot and allow The Rock to pick his own opponent. Instead, we were told by Shawn Michaels, who was the commissioner at that time, that per the WWE rulebook, which I've never seen a picture of, I would love to get myself a copy of this rulebook, if the winner of the Royal Rumble cannot or will not compete for the championship at WrestleMania, the runner-up would get their spot instead, that being Stone Cold Steve Austin. Austin then agreed to put his WrestleMania title match on the line if McMahon agreed to meet him in a cage match, and so that is how we got to this point. McMahon took this hellacious bump off the side of the cage down through the announce table. He had to be probably 10 feet up or so. At 53 years old, taking a bump like that. Absolute madman. Austin had the match won later on when Paul White made his debut coming off his run as the Giant in WCW. He really was the first big name from WCW to come over to WWE. I know, Jeff Jarrett did, Sean Waltman had come over the year prior, but the Giant was a bigger star than either of those guys. So he came up through the ring, he slammed Austin into each side of the cage, and then he picked him up like a small child, and he hurled him into one of the side panels on the cage, which came loose, and as it slowly swung open with Austin on it, this was the old blue bar cage, except it was black. I do miss those cages. I guess the wrestlers don't because it hurt like a bitch when you would get thrown into it. Austin just slowly begins to climb down, and his feet touch the floor, and he wins the match. Now, I thought at that time, and I still think all these years later, over 20 years now, that was a pretty clever finish. The whole, throw him into the cage, and then he climbs down as the thing swings open. I liked that. I thought that was a clever finish to the match. And with the win, Austin punched his ticket to WrestleMania to challenge The Rock for the championship. A match that some people in the company tried to get changed. There's a lot of stories about that WrestleMania 15 main event. Vince Russo, for example, and this is his story, claims that he had pitched Mankind to be added to the match to make it a triple threat, sort of a reward of sorts for all that Foley had put himself through and done for the company over the year prior. And he said that Vince McMahon was receptive to the idea, and at one point it was thought that this would be a triple threat. It would be Austin, Rock, and Mankind, who had been feuding with Rock for many months for the title, right? Playing hot potato with the belt up until that point. Let's get Mick in there. Let's get Mick a WrestleMania main event. He's not going to win, but let's get him in there. But he says that Shawn Michaels, for whatever reason, he doesn't know why, Shawn Michaels, who was around sometimes at that point, behind the scenes, was in Austin's ear. And he suspects that he was trying to convince him that, no, this needs to be a one-on-one match. It shouldn't be a three-way. Foley shouldn't be in the match. Or maybe Rock. Whoever it was that Michaels thought should be out of the match, he thought it should be one-on-one. Austin eventually went to Vince McMahon and said, look, I don't feel really comfortable about this being a triple threat. It should be one-on-one. Let's do me and Rock. And so even though he had signed off on the other idea for a triple threat, McMahon changed it to, which is a better match. I mean, it should never have been a triple threat. Vince McMahon changed it to one-on-one. Austin against The Rock. Now, Foley was part of it. He didn't technically get to be involved in his first WrestleMania main event because he came out to be the referee and count the winning fall. So that was maybe the consolation there. That's how we'll get Mick to at least be part of this match in some way. And then he presented Austin with the belt when the match was over. So I do believe him. I do believe there is truth to that story. And Foley may have talked about it in his first book, Have a Nice Day. I have the book. I haven't gone back and checked. He may have mentioned that same story. That originally he was going to be part of that match as a wrestler. I just don't remember what he may have said about it. The Rock himself did some kind of Facebook Live thing, I think, a while back, maybe a few years ago, and he actually was answering questions and talked about the fact that he didn't name names, but he talked about the fact that there were people in the locker room who actively lobbied for him to be removed from that WrestleMania main event and not be in the match. He's too young, he's too green, he doesn't belong in there. Now, I have always heard that the people who were talking the loudest, trying to get Rock 86th from that match, was Shawn Michaels and or Triple H. They didn't want Rock in there. They lobbied for him to be removed and either do Austin against Triple H or even Austin against Mankind. And Vince McMahon wouldn't budge. But, so who knows? Who knows who the names were that Rock is referring to? It would make sense that it would be Triple H or Michaels and Triple H. The jealousy was real. Back then, I believe it. I believe the jealousy was very real.